Carolyn, welcome to the show.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for having me.
I'm doing very good. I'm excited to have this conversation. I always learn a lot about things like this. And, we were speaking before I hit record. We're in Mexico and there's lots of household contaminants and all sorts of things that I know are affecting our health. So I always want to learn more and more about that. And more importantly, figure out what we can do about it when, in this case, we're not in charge of building the house, right? We can build a house and we can make them healthy. And that's what we're used to doing. But what do you do after? So I have all sorts of questions. Before we get into those, I'd love to know a little bit more about you and what your journey, what brought you to this place. You've been doing this a very long time, since before it was cool.
Yeah, before it's fashionable.
Yeah. So I'd love to know what brought you to that point and what brought you to today.
Yeah, so I've been an environmental consultant for 23 years, but I started originally I was working in production. I was working in New York City. I actually started as a Howard Stern show intern, which is kind of always funny. People find that amusing. But I worked in production and got into radio production and was in New York City. And I developed, just basic allergies, like something wasn't right. And I had never had allergies in my whole life. So back then, like everybody kind of has that story, you get into it. Fortunately or unfortunately, I was pretty inquisitive for a young woman at that age. And I decided, this is strange. Why do I have allergies? What's going on? What's changed? Why am I like this? And I just decided to sink my mind into anything I could find about how our homes and residences really impacted us. So it wasn't something that was even available. We didn't have internet back then. We didn't have mold testing for residences back then. And I actually started like testing mold in a Petri dish. Like we'd put Petri dishes out and then we'd put them under a microscope and look at this mold that was forming. And it was so archaic at the time, like people think, oh, well, they talk about mold now. And I'm like, oh, no, you don't know. Like there wasn't, we'd have to figure out what kind of species it was and what kind of genus it was and where, why was it growing here? And so there were a lot of, at the time, more commercial applications for industry professionals working in environmental arena, but not in homes. Like nobody did a home. It wasn't heard of. So I started on that journey and then it just ballooned, without going into it, but it just became a huge, huge industry. And I'm, happy to be a pioneer in that industry, which is kind of nice too.
What were the allergies that started it for you? Because I'm sure it's the same thing that's happening now and people are just get used to them, right? Like some people are like, oh, it's my allergies. I've had them my entire life. They must be normal.
Yeah, it wasn't. And I say allergies too. That's a good question. I remember having like I constantly felt like a fullness, like kind of like in my stomach and like almost like I had this band that was going around and they couldn't figure it out. And I think at the time when I go back and look at it, I think they were spraying pesticide inside our apartment buildings. Like we would just let them in, right? We didn't know, we were young kids. Oh, just come on in and spray. And they'd come in with their machine and start spraying our apartment, which is like a no-no. Like you really don't want to do those things. But back then we didn't know. And I think it was probably a reaction to something like that as I go back and think about it. But it got me into understanding that there were, water damage in a building and other things that I was starting to look at. Back then we didn't look at pesticides as much, but now we do. So it's interesting, what gets us on that path. But if I had to guess, it was something kind of neurotoxin that was probably in the air at the time.
Yeah, that's a scary thing, right? You never know what's being sprayed. And I've had some other interesting conversations and I can't remember the numbers, but there's like hundreds of new chemicals that come out every year. And there's no way that anybody can control them and say whether or not it's banned or not, right? So who knows what they're putting into our so-called food and getting rid of through who knows what process, right?
Right. And every time we get smart, like we start to like figure out, hey, glyphosate, it's not good for us. And then we start to get onto like a lawsuit and people start to say, hey, I want to use less of it. They switch it up and then they're using something else. Right. So it makes my job challenging. Oh, it's always challenging to kind of stay ahead of it. But I think the smarter you are and, the more, I like to say eco-friendly you are, but that's not always it's not always truth because just because something's green doesn't mean it's healthy for you. So I think the more you become cognizant of what you're using, I think the smarter you become. So it's not always about, I hate, I don't like, I shouldn't say hate, but I don't like the word green because I think it's very deceptive. I think that just because something's green doesn't mean that it's good for you. So it's just
same with sustainable.
Yeah.
Sustainable is another word
Right.
that gets overused.
And people don't really understand what that means, right? I mean, traditionally, when you build a home, you're always going to have synthetic compounds. You're always going to have something that's also natural. I mean, wood's natural, for example, but it produces formaldehyde. So people often say, well, I'm going to build a house with low formaldehyde products. And I'm like, well, it's really impossible to do because you're using wood and wood naturally has it. So, until you start to really understand it, but it's more about minimizing, right? Not doing too much, sort of this balance, what I call that yin and yang that exists in nature. You want to be able to balance things and not have too much of something. And I think that's kind of the way to go. A little something bad is okay, depending on what it is, but it's how you balance it in your life that makes it healthier.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's so many things, like it's often like choose your poison, right? So
Yeah.
you can choose something that's maybe supposed to be better for your health, right? So less chemicals. But for example, like a caulking that doesn't have any chemicals and any mold resistant chemicals is technically better, or can be better, but then mold can grow on it, which isn't
Right.
good for you either. Right.
Right.
So
It's
then
this,
you
there's
have to be on
always a
top of it.
balance at everything. Like when you're picking something for a house, I always tell my clients, like, just know the product, know the pluses and the minuses, and then you can make a better decision. It's all about education. Like, and that's huge. I mean, it's important for everything that you do, right? To sort of really have an understanding as to, we talk about air purifiers a lot. I had a conversation with a colleague the other day and we were saying, he asked me my honest opinion. He's like, what do you think of air purifiers? And I said, well, do you want my opinion? Because my opinion isn't really that a purifier is going to fix all your problems. It's not. And it could actually be worse in certain circumstances, right? So you could use a purifier, and if you collect a lot of dog protein in it or cat protein or molds and you don't change the filter, then it becomes more of a detriment than it does a positive. So, and depending on what you're trying to solve in a home, a purifier can help you or hurt you too. So it's so fascinating, but once you know your product, know the pluses and minuses, then you can better apply any of these things to what you're doing and come up with a better outcome.
So
without
yeah, I'd
getting
like to
too
dig into
crazy.
that a little bit because, one of my questions is going to be, what can you do if, not everyone has the money to build their own house, renovate their own house, to start making major changes within their home. But I want to go back to the formaldehyde. So formaldehyde being in wood naturally, what does that mean? That's the first I've heard of that myself. So what does it come out after you've chopped
Mhm.
the tree down and put it into your house? How long does it come out for? Like what are those things that we should be concerned about within a home? And if so, what do we do about them?
Right. So formaldehyde, well, at least in the US, right, it's one of the biggest concerns we have because it's a carcinogen. And we see such high levels of it throughout our building practices, right, and building products. So what happens is if we measure homes, so in the US, when I go out, I typically, if I'm doing what we call VOC testing, I also run what's called the formaldehyde panel. And that basically tells me in your home, what's the general occurrence of formaldehyde, what's the level of it, and how much are you exposed to? And in the US, we're exposed to a lot more of it than you would say if you were in Europe and they were building. So because a lot of our products contain it all the time. They use it just like, you're drinking water, right? They put it in, oh, let's put a little formaldehyde here. And then of course you have it naturally occurring in building products. So these numbers get really high. And so when we look at homes, we're really trying to get these numbers down much lower, towards a European standard. But in the US, it kind of gets challenging because when you do a new build, for example, you're usually very high in formaldehyde. But again, it's a carcinogen. It's something that you want to be aware of when you're building a house. And to me, you want to check it to see where you come in, as far as your number. So you know, if you need to ventilate, if you have to improve your circulation, air circulation, all of that stuff, or even if you want to use different products to minimize it.
So what can we do to minimize? So formaldehyde, you put wood in your house, you're going to have formaldehyde no matter
Correct.
what.
Right.
Does it stop off gassing formaldehyde?
Yeah,
at a certain point?
formaldehyde
Okay.
definitely decreases over time. Most houses have it though, regardless. Like they'll just have, like let's just say for science factors, say you have 30 nanograms per liter of formaldehyde. That's somewhere around the average, right? But when you do a new build, you're usually up around 80 or 90, just to give you an idea. Like somebody's like, what does that mean to me?
And what-
But it's almost double, even triple when you have a new build. You
If you
are
were to
going to have
measure the air outside, sorry, just for reference, if you were to measure the air outside, will you find formaldehyde in the air outside?
Yeah, you will. But it'll be obviously much lower. So when it's,
Right.
when you start to go into a closed space and you're closed in, that's when it really becomes a problem, right? It's like radon is a perfect example. Radon goes out into the atmosphere, but it doesn't become a problem until we're closed in with it. And then, we create these tighter building structures. And then of course, with energy efficiency, it's just making everything worse. And then we're just increasing all of these chemicals and radon and molds and moisture and all these things get trapped in the house. And then they, grow exponentially because of the fact that we're so tight, we're not breathing. And I don't like to use
assuming that the ventilation isn't done properly in the house.
Right. But even so, like what's interesting is like, we were just looking at a house and I typically never really did too much radon analysis, right? Most people test during their home inspection and then they kind of forget it, or they put in a radon mitigation system and they just say, oh, my radon's fine, right? I have a mitigation system. So I started working with a company called EcoSense and they said, let us send you this EcoCube and we just want you to plug it in and constantly monitor your radon. And I was blown away because here, I'm a person who obviously I preach so much about healthy homes and I have one, or at least I think I have one. And I put this in and started monitoring it. And that radon level was so significantly variable that like it's some days you could be at 16 picocuries and some days you could be at 2. And depending on when you test your home, like during a home inspection, if you don't have radon mitigation, you don't really know what your exposure is unless you're really monitoring on a day-to-day basis. And the other interesting thing I found is that a lot of the mitigation systems, 30% of them aren't even working properly. So the fan could be not working properly. If you have a passive system, it might not be pulling properly. It might not be hitting like a certain part, like, obviously it goes out under the ground and pulls the air. But if there's a pocket that doesn't actually get pulled up, it starts going back up into the envelope. You could end up with radon in your house. So I just found it so fascinating that we think we're improving things sometimes, but we're not. And there's always like reason to monitor and to kind of look into what these levels are. So it's important to do it all the time because you don't know what you have. It's just kind of fascinating to me.
Right. Now, you mentioned air purifiers can potentially make things worse if you don't change the filter. So one, do they work? And in which cases should we be using air purifiers?
So air purifiers, when I originally started my career, I was like a big proponent of them. Right. And then, so what happened was I started to notice that clients didn't change the filters. They didn't like to do the maintenance. And then also, depending on what you were trying to get rid of, you didn't want to trap something in a purifier in the corner and leave it there because it would still affect the occupant. So for example, let's take cat, right? Cat is a big thing. It's a common protein that we find in homes all the time when we test for different types of proteins. And proteins can be in things like cat, it could be dog, it could be horse, cow. We do peanut testing, for people who are allergic to peanuts. So all these proteins sort of stay in an environment. And if you trap it in a filter and you have someone who's allergic to it in the space or sensitive to it, it continues to bother them, even though it's in the filter, because the filter is not hermetically sealed, right? So that protein is in space and they're sensitive to it. It's like if you have a cat in the room with you, you're going to be allergic to the cat. You're going to have the allergy, right? Same with a purifier sitting there. So I started to notice that clients, we would do remediation on a home and I'm like, why aren't they getting better? Like, what is the issue? And then we would see that the purifiers were still left behind and they had the dirty filter in there. And then we started to put it together like, wait a minute, these things, they're not hermetically sealed. They get out. All these things can get out. And for depending on what you're treating for, the actual filter can make things worse. So it's really important to know what you have, to test your home, to see what contaminants you have and know specifically what you're dealing with, and then apply applications. So we developed I developed a model that works for a healthy home. And I think it's what I call our healthy home trifecta. And so you need 3 things, right? So you need to be educated about how these allergens and contaminants work, and also how not to bring them into your home, because there's a whole way of living that's involved with creating a healthy home space that people like you need to educate consumers and then also clients about. The second thing is that we definitely need technology to achieve some of these optimal conditions that we need, whether you're talking about ERVs, you're talking about dehumidification, you're talking about sensor systems that allow us to know that these contaminants are there or also help to improve the air quality. And then thirdly, we have to make sure that how we're building, and obviously building science is a big component to healthy homes. And if you don't have those three things working in your favor or working together, you're never going to achieve at least what I consider to be a more sought after environment, right? So those are the key. And that's why like conversations like this are so important, because building is so important. And then of course, like the education piece, because if someone is not educated and you build them this, state of the art home that is supposed to be healthy or healthier, and they decide we're going to wear shoes in the house, we're going to collect gas cans in the house, we're going to put all kinds of bags of, weed killer and leave it in the house. And then they decide, oh, we're going to leave 60 paint cans in the basement. All of that building that you just did is for naught, because they created an environment that's toxic all on their own right. So that's why it's important for all of us to be educated about how to create these spaces. Because if you don't know, then you're going to be back at square one again.
Yeah, that's a really good point to be, storage, right? People think out of sight, out of mind, right?
Oh,
but you're not
completely.
realizing how that gets throughout your entire home.
People think gas, they always say to me, well, it's the garage. Like, what are you talking about? That's not part of the house, or it's the basement or crawl space. They're like, that's not part of a house. I'm like, no, don't you understand? Like, we have pressurization. Anything that you put in those spaces gets pulled into the house. And then through stack effect, it goes up like a big arrow, right? You get this arrow that comes in and goes up. And so unless you're doing something to break pressure from those spaces, you're going to be breathing in whatever's in, whether it's gasoline. And I think when I do a lot of air testing, what people find interesting is we give them a list, right? We do VOC testing, for example, and then we sit down with them and we break it down and say, okay, here's the chemical, here's what is producing this. And their mind is blown. Like they'll see D-limonene, which means nothing to a normal person. And then we say, you're using a disinfection wipe. And they're like, well, how do you know that? And we're like, because this chemical compound is found in this, and this is what you're using. And like something as benign as a disinfection wipe. I mean, during COVID, it was insane. We saw, off the chart numbers of volatile organics in people's homes, because they were storing the wipes. They were wiping every surface. They were, doing the doorknobs and the countertops. And so these numbers got super high, and we started to realize all these wipes were like no good, and D-limonene, for people who don't know, is that citrus smell. So when you smell citrus, you're like, oh, that smells great. It could be completely natural, but it's not. It's still a volatile organic. And so that's where we go back to this whole concept that like, just because something's green, which is natural, doesn't mean it's good for you in abundance. Your body can't differentiate between a synthetic VOC. Like, let's take something like, if you were to breathe in naphthalene, right? Naphthalene is traditionally found in, diesel fuel. Or if you're D-limonene or your eucalyptus or lavender, it doesn't know the difference. It just knows that it's VOCs, and it's going to try to get rid of it. And it's also going to inundate your body, and your body's going to have to clear it.
So where do I go with this? I got a few questions. They keep coming to mind.
Like a mind blow.
Yeah. All right. So if I go back to, let's go back to VOCs a little bit. Now, I've had other conversations with people, and one conversation in particular, we talked about VOCs and how not all VOCs are necessarily bad. And I'd like to get your input on that, because the issue, from what I understand, this little while ago that I had the conversation, VOCs could create smog. And that was the initial problem with VOCs. So what happened is they got them, they decided to get rid of VOCs. So they started telling paint, for example, it's in paint, right? So they said, get rid of VOCs, but then all those paint suppliers started putting in all sorts of other chemicals that weren't regulated, that were even worse than VOCs, when the VOC was actually fine, unless it came into contact with a certain, I think it had to do with sunlight or something like that.
Right. It all had to do with like outside pollution to begin with volatile
Right.
organic. But when you, so yeah, like what happened with paint cans, or with paint in general, right? Paint would hit you in the face, right? You'd walk in and be this extremely like high level of chemical smell. And you'd be like, oh my God, for like a week, your house would smell tremendously bad. And then all of a sudden, then it would dissipate quicker. But when they switched chemicals to like what we call low VOC or zero VOC paint, which zero doesn't even exist, it's like a whole fake thing, but they get away with marketing it. They basically turned to chemical compounds that were like harder to detect, right, from a sense of smell perspective, but they also last so much longer. So now you've got like a longer exposure versus having a big exposure that hits you in the face at a very high level and then dissipates quickly. Now we pick up these things for 2.5 years. So when I'm testing, I can tell if somebody painted their home, because these volatiles will stay around for 18 months to 2 years. So it's kind of
Wow.
incredible. And so people change paint like they change shoes, right? So I have a lot of clients who are into designing and I'm like, look, I have to tell them, you don't want to do this as much as you think you do, because now you're constantly exposing yourself to high levels of volatile organics. And we know that when volatile organics get high, we start to see breathing problems. We start to see dizziness. We start to see people with dried out sinuses. They're complaining that they don't feel well. Then we also are increasing our risk of carcinogens, because VOCs, though that's the chemical compound, some of these things that are volatile organics are carcinogens as well. So then we start to see all the things that come from petroleum-based products. And then we see the relationships between a lot of, for example, in Canada, we got very concerned with combustibles, things that come off when you start your car, right? And then, so we saw benzene exposure would increase your risk of getting non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So some of these volatile organics can really wreak havoc on your system and cause cancer and all of these other things. So to me, I don't want to see high volatiles in a home. I like to see 500 nanograms per liter or less. Most of my clients end up being about 250 by the time we get done reevaluating their homes and making sure that they're not using, things that promote high VOCs in the home. And then also, it's important to realize that sometimes you will have an influx, right? Like, so if you have somebody who comes and cuts your grass outside and they are using gas powered equipment, you're going to see these higher levels come up and then go down. That doesn't concern me as much, as long as you come back to a consistent low level and you're not having that high exposure all the time.
Right. Now, going back to the wipes as well, so those chemicals that come off the wipes, is it, for example, my wife and I, we just use vinegar, right? She wipes everything down with like vinegar and paper towel. We're not using, and we know like natural coloring or natural flavors or natural scent, anything that's natural is not natural.
Right.
So we avoid,
but even
all those.
anything that has like even vinegar, right? Anything that's got a profound odor to it, you want to try to stay away from. Like I always say, houses should be benign, right? You should walk into a house and really not smell anything. It should be like sort of nose neutral. And a little bit of smell here and there. It's not that I expect people to live in a bubble, because I don't, but you don't want to really have things that are really, really, obtrusive, right? You don't want things that are really odorous. And even vinegar, it's got its own, it leaves behind its own residue and things like that. And so like, if you do use it, you want to dilute it. I usually recommend to people a little like dish detergent, soap and water, like a very mild surfactant with no scent goes a long way. And the reason you want to use a surfactant is because it's able to break up things. So we have like dust mites and oils and proteins and things like that. And you want to remove them. Like what happens a lot when people clean, because most people don't know how to clean properly, we end up like shoving everything around and not properly removing all this dander. We shed 500 million skin cells a day. It's like really disgusting. And so that goes into our bedding. It goes into our carpets. It goes into whatever you have in, and you need to remove these things to keep your home clean. Because if you don't remove dander, for example, then the dust mites come and they get some humidity and they say, hey, this is like chocolate cake. I'm going to feed on the dander. So now you've got high skin cell, you've got high dander counts, you've got high dust mites, and then it starts to accumulate, right? And then people say, oh, well, I'm going to use some VOCs. I'm going to use this spray. I'm going to use some kind of air freshener, and then that starts clinging to the dander and the skin cells. And now you've got that problem. And then you add in maybe pets and animals and mice and cows that live nearby and dogs. And then that adds to the mix. And then we start talking about molds and we say, oh, we've got a mold problem. We have a water damage problem. So now that adds to the mix. And now we've got, oh, we're going to do a remodel project in our home. And then you do that. Now you've got silica dust and formaldehyde, and you've got chemical compounds from all kinds of products that you've used. So you see how it like becomes this big thing and it keeps going and going. And so if you're not removing things or watching what you're bringing in, you easily create this environment that's just filled with all kinds of stuff that your body's got to get rid of. And that also causes inflammation in the body.
You convinced me I'm going to live in a bubble.
No.
I
don't. I don't, but it's once you understand how these things work, that's when you have to start getting smart and you have to say, okay, I've got to have a better vacuum. Like people go, I don't want to spend $900 on a vacuum. I don't want to spend $1,200. Well, guess what? You need to. You've got to be removing things from the environment.
Which vacuum do you recommend?
I like obviously a lot of the SIBO makes a good vacuum, which is basically a German brand. Miele makes a good vacuum. And there's other companies out there too. They need to be sealed. So like if you open up your canister and you see dust flying all over outside of the bag, you're done. Like that's not working. So you have to have a sealed system, and you don't want to fill your bag up all the way. You want to make sure that you always remove your bag earlier, because what happens is as soon as the bag gets like a little bit over half full, all the stuff starts coming out, right? So you want to make sure it's staying contained when you're vacuuming and that you're actually getting rid of that stuff. Or some people have, you know, a whole house system, vacuum system too. But you want it to all be maintained and contained to that space.
Right. That makes sense. Now going back to the vinegar. So I'll use myself as an example. We're using all unscented stuff like detergents for everything, for soaps and everything. Like my last trip to Ottawa, I came back, and as soon as I came in, my wife was like, "My mom did your laundry, didn't she?"
Yeah, because
Like,
you can
yeah, why? She's
tell.
like, she could smell it. As soon as she opened the suitcase, she could smell it on the shirt that I was
Oh, of course,
wearing.
of course.
But beyond that, we have been using vinegars. So what's in vinegar that's not good for us? So I understand maybe it doesn't break things down. Maybe it's just wiping things around from what you're saying, but the smell is also not great for us.
Yeah, the vinegar actually stays behind and actually leaves a volatile organic behind. And the thing with vinegar is that though it's a good disinfectant, it's abrasive, right? It's an acid. So I find that the surfactants work a little bit better. I mean, vinegar can have its place. Like I like it on glass substances, but when you start to use a lot of it and you don't dilute it, your house will actually end up smelling like an Easter egg. So you want to like, you know, you shouldn't really have that. I like to use like and I use vinegar and water. A mild base surfactant works great. Making sure you're dusting, making sure you're not like reusing rags. Like even though it's not the most environmentally friendly, I do like to make sure that you have like either use a paper towel or use something and dispose of it. Because if you have a really dirty area and you're just throwing that into your washing machine, it doesn't necessarily get clean well, especially a lot of the washers now with energy efficient, they don't work as great. They don't get up to a high temperature. They don't sanitize the way we want them to. So sometimes you have to use a rag that's more disposable to make sure you're getting rid of stuff. But making sure you're cleaning and dusting regularly. Like if you've got 4 people that live in your home, okay, so and pets count as people too. So let's say you have 2 adults and 2 pets, that's 4. You need to be vacuuming that many times a week. And my clients go, "Oh my God, I can't do that. It's too much." But you want to work towards that goal.
Robot
So
vacuums.
yeah, I think they're great. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
This
me
is where
too.
technology helps us because we don't want to spend like, 4 days a week vacuuming. However, from a cleanliness standpoint, from a health standpoint, we need to be. So I think Roombas, anything that goes around and does it for you is fantastic.
Now, how do we test? Like if we live close to you, we can call you and you can come test our house, but we don't all live close to you. So what are some other things that we can do? Are there tests that we can buy? And if we do buy them, are they accurate? How do we go about just wanting to first figure out what do we need to get rid of from our house?
Yeah. So, well, we test all over the country now. So we go all over. I mean, from Australia to New Zealand to Canada, we do it all pretty much. So what we do with people who are out of our service area is that we have designed kits now where we send them to you. You basically do the testing that gets sent back to our laboratory. And then within a couple of days, we have results, and we can do everything from, as we talked about, your protein testing, your dust mites, your dander, your building products, your VOCs, your formaldehydes, your molds, your biologics, your bacteria. So we basically cover a huge gamut. And then we also do water testing. So for anyone in the US, especially, that's always accessible to them. But yes, there's test kits on the market. Like we have our Examine Air test kit, which is a mold and allergen test kit. There's other kits that are available too. I like to encourage people to test, like, even if you're, you can't afford something and you have like a Petri dish test that isn't the most accurate. I like to encourage people to do that because it gets them in the mind frame of, hey, we do need to test to figure out what's going on, because you can't walk into a home and just look at it and say, oh, this home has this problem or this problem. And I mean, I've been doing inspections. I've done 30,000 houses in my career. I've been in lots of places that I'll look and I'll say, oh, it looks pretty good in here. And I'll run the tests. And it's just mind blows me because I'm like, oh my God, there's a mold problem or there's a VOC problem or whatever, dust dander. So you can't see these things, are invisible to the eye a lot of the time. And so you do need to test. So I encourage people, like, just do any kind of test to kind of get a baseline. And then if something comes back, then you can always seek out a professional environmental consultant to kind of help you. And obviously, if you live in places where it's not accessible, then you can call a company like ours and we can send you out whatever you need and you can do it. So there's no reason not to be. And the other thing that I'm liking a lot now, which we do, is we do a lot with sensor systems that you can install. We sell what's called a Yoo-hoo that can be installed in your home. And it basically looks like an Alexa, and it gives us all that data. So we can look at it. You can look at it. We're looking at your particulates, your carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, your nitric oxides, your VOC levels. It's a pretty a particulate level. So it's giving us a really good cross section of what's going on all the time, like a constant monitor. So I think sensors are where it's going in the future, and creating sensors that work together. Because right now we've got a lot of companies producing different sensors for whether it's radon, particulate. We have a partnership with Yoo-hoo because of the fact that their sensor system gives us a lot of more data. They're able to sense a lot of things that we need because, obviously just doing radon doesn't help us. So, but yeah, I think that's where it's going as far as like being able to monitor. Every home will have a sensor.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because it's easy to put it in at when you're building or when you're renovating it. I'm sure a lot of these things can go in after the fact fairly easily too.
Yeah, of course.
Now,
So-
what are these kits? So if somebody wanted to test and they want to reach out to you, like what are people going to expect to pay? Or how does it work?
So our Examine test kit, which is EXAMIN, like examine, and then instead of E, it's AIR at the end.com. That test allows us to look at all your molds. So it runs about $400, and that allows you to have 3 samples inside the home and 1 sample outside. And that's our really comprehensive test, right? So it's looking at all your molds, your dust mites, your dander, even your pollen outside. It's looking at all your building products. So we look at formaldehyde, we look at silica dust. Silica dust is a big issue, especially on new builds, because we find that a lot of the cleanup isn't done properly. And so what happens is you'll get a lot of the silica dust residue in the home, and it's very easy to get 3 times the average of what you should be breathing. Like we just had a client who actually went to lawsuit. They had remediation done in their basement, and they came in and they did not use a wet saw when they were sawing up the concrete. So they had silica dust that went through their entire home. Like it was everywhere. And they had a child in the home who had cystic fibrosis. And this contractor just did a messy job. Plus, OSHA standards were violated. They were the employees themselves were working in poor conditions where they should never have been breathing in silica dust at that level. And it was very strange because we had monitored the house before, like we had just done testing because the daughter had fibrosis. We were looking at molds. We weren't even looking at it, but I always run silica because it's one of the things that I just worry about. I want to see that houses are low and that if you've done remodeling, you don't have it sitting in your ducts. And so we had done it, and then they did construction, and then we happened to say, wow, there's a problem. There's dust everywhere. And then I tested after. So we had the evidence. And then they ended up going right to the consumer affairs. We actually brought it to consumer affairs, and the client just won recently a settlement, which is kind of amazing because, this kind of holds contractors to a new bar, if you will. Like they can't just go in and create a bomb and blow up a house and then not be responsible for the cleanup and what they do when they're doing the project. So I found it kind of interesting. And that just happened. Like we just actually, the client called me and said, hey, we got a settlement thanks to your Examine because that's what they used. That was yesterday.
Great.
Yeah.
So I think the other thing too, so if we start doing more things like this, I think people need to also understand that as a contractor. So speaking from a contractor, I'm not going to say we shouldn't do that, but it takes more time and more effort, right? So there's more work, and people need to be willing to pay for it. And a lot of people go out and price shop. We don't take on jobs like that, but I think the homeowners also need to take some responsibility in the sense that, well, sometimes you get what you pay for.
Right. Well,
So,
and what was interesting with this client, she said, like, we had this discussion. She's like, everybody should test their home before they do some kind of project. And then they know where their baseline is. And then they know, do I have to clean up? And it's not even just a responsibility of you, the contractor. It's a responsibility of everyone. Because I think people just want to get their lives back after they do a remodel, right? And they just say, oh, I'm just, I just want to put everything back. But there is a due diligence that you have to do as a homeowner. You need to clean up. Like even after the contractor, it's like cleaning up for the cleaning lady. You need to clean up after the contractor cleans up because they're not going to clean up like you would, that's just.
I'm sure silica being in Mexico, everything's concrete here, right? I'm sure it's all over the place, and
I'm sure
all over the place. It's crazy.
Mm.
So I'm learning so much. This is great.
Yeah, nice.
So, all right. So what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing today? And that could be, in your business, it could be in the industry. Like what are something that seems to be taking a good portion of your time?
Um, I mean, I think it's always education, because I think clients come to you with, they think they have one problem. Like, we'll get a lot of people who come to us and they're like, we have a mold issue. We definitively have a mold issue. And I have to explain to them, like, look, there's so many other things in a house that can go wrong. Like, I had a client that for like a year, well, I mean, leading up to before they came to us, he was really, really, really sick, his whole family. And he went to a doctor, and doctor's like, oh, I think you have a mold problem. He went to a functional medicine doctor, and he said, look, you have a mold issue. That's why you're this sick. And then he came back to me and he's like, I have a mold issue. And we tested the house. And I said, not a mold issue. Like, I bet my career on it. I've been doing this a long time. And he's like, well, my doctor says I have a mold issue. And I'm like, look, there's a lot of things in homes that go wrong. It's not just mold that can make you sick. So we started investigating, and I said, look, I want your gas checked, your natural gas. And he said, oh, no, my doctor said it's not that. And I said, well, look, it's free to check your natural gas. Like, I recommend all my clients do it. We're seeing more and more natural gas leaks. I said, I think you should do it. So he didn't do it. A year comes back. He comes back to me in a year and he says, I still want to test for mold. I think I have mold exposure. And I'm like, I'm telling you, like, this is not your issue. And I said, did you check your natural gas? And he says, no. I said, okay. And I said, well, I'm not going to work with you anymore until you do. And I said, I'm sorry, but that's just the way you got to let me do my job. And so he's like, all right. He calls. The natural gas company comes out. Every joint in the house had never been properly put together. The entire house was filled. They shut the house down immediately. And then they had to fix all of the joints, because this was a problem they inherited when they bought the house. It had never been done right. And so they were all sick and, obviously feeling a lot better now that that's been fixed. But these are the types of things like in homes that we constantly have to monitor. Like, we've always focused on commercial, but in reality, we spend so much time in our homes. It's supposed to be our oasis. And there's so much between water and gas and petroleum product and all the things we store, like we're talking about. I mean, it's just a plethora of stuff that can go wrong. And it makes for me, every time I think, okay, that's it. Like, there's never going to be another issue. It's something else presents. And I'm like, oh my God, what's it going to be next? Like, I can't handle it.
It's like, and then it gets to a point where you just have so much information. And it's like, what do you do with all right? So I think, do people ever get like so overwhelmed that they're just like, forget it, like, I can't deal with this anymore?
Well, most of the time we fix them, right? So
Okay.
like, when people come to us, they come to us for various reasons. So some people come because they're not feeling well, doctors send them to us. I mean, I believe, I'm on the fringe, but I believe 85% to 95% of all disease states are caused by environmental factors. And I studied public health at the University of Southern California. And the more that I saw there, the more we saw these correlations, right? So they studied mice and they exposed mice to high level of pollution. And if you had the Alzheimer's gene, the APOE4 gene, guess what would happen if you were exposed to high level of pollution in a city area like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York? You would develop amyloid plaque at a faster rate. The mice would develop amyloid plaque. So when you start to apply things like pollution, particulate, all of those things to the body, these affect us in so many ways. And if they can activate gene states, then like the APOE4 gene, they can activate other genes like the BRCA gene. So to me, which is a breast cancer gene. So what we know is that these environmental factors directly impact our health. When you're around them, whether it's dust mites, dander, it promotes inflammation in the body. And so what I believe happens is that our bodies are full of inflammation, and then we get these disease states that present depending on our genetics. But overall, if we were living in better environments and having less of this inflammation as a whole populace, I think that we would, definitely extend our lifespan, by a good 10 years for sure.
That's great to hear. There is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes. I mean, this is like all like we need to learn to live differently. Right.
Yeah.
And again, it comes to back to that balance. And this is a huge thing with me. I mean, you go to a doctor, you get your blood scan, you get blood work, you get urine, you get your scans, you get all this stuff done. But when does a doctor ever ask you what's in your environment? Like, what are you doing? Very rarely you'll get, every once in a while get a physician that asks you, but it's on a very, benign level. It's not going in depth at all. And then when you start to like look at someone like me who's looking at these factors about health and how it's correlating back to our homes and what we see, we know that there's a big component here to why people don't feel well in their houses.
Yeah, I believe it for sure, because we've run into it. We're very healthy people and don't get sick.
Knock wood.
So yeah, knock on wood. But when things happen, we're like, all right, we didn't change anything in in how we eat? Did our environment change, right? Or did we bring something new? And that's what we start to think about. And it's yeah, you just got to figure it out, right? So I'm super interested in these tests actually. But anyway, let's go to, what are you most excited about for the future? There's, I don't know if it's the sensors, there's got to be, maybe there's technology that's helping this industry. But what's got you excited for another 23 years of being in the industry?
Yeah. I mean, like what was interesting is that obviously like we have the trademarks, like My Healthy Home, Healthy Home Expert. Those are things I trademarked many, many moons ago. Right. And so now we're seeing this term healthy home, which no one even thought about. Like back, they were talking about green, right? When I originally started, the green movement was starting and people were talking about green and green and green. And I always said, it's just not green. That's not the way we want to be. We want to be healthy. We want to have a healthy home. So now that term healthy home is becoming so prevalent you turn around in every industry, whether it's, like a Procter and Gamble, or you're looking at like a Panasonic of the world, like they're all talking about healthy homes. And it makes me happy because I think we're going to really, we're going to impact that our homes are going to change dramatically. I think we're going to see big improvements, not only from a personal care products, whether you're talking about detergents. I mean, already New York just mandated, I saw it a couple of weeks ago, but they're actually saying no more to certain laundry detergents, right? Because of the carcinogenic properties in them. And we've known this for a long time. I mean, people say to me, well, why do I not want to use like a traditional laundry detergent? And there's many reasons. One, it's bad for you, right? You're using carcinogens. You're using these products that stay on your body. Your skin is your largest bodily organ. You put something on your skin, it's in your body in 26 seconds or less. So when we get people to focus on, I'm going to be healthier because I use something else, right? Like it's a selfish thing, because we're all about, nobody cares about the environment. I mean, I hate to say it, like on a very superficial level, it's like, oh, I care about the environment, but we really don't, right? But we personally, when people are affected by something, you're going to make bigger changes because it personally affects you and you're going to be unhealthy, right? And then what happens is when we change the way one person operates in the world, we directly impact the environment as a secondary, secondary as to, the first. So it's, what's kind of cool is that if we can get you to be selfish and want to be healthy and do it for you, you'll actually impact the environment without you even knowing you're doing that, just by choosing a better detergent or choosing to live a healthier way. So I kind of like that, if we can get each individual to want to be concerned about improving their health and their lifespan, will improve the environment, just because it'll be a secondary effect of those education, the education that we do.
Absolutely. I believe that too. And that's one of the reasons we continue to do what we do. And another thing I've been learning about is soil health these days and how that helps us. And, I tell people, I'm like, if you want to help yourself and by default, help the environment, just buy organic produce.
Right.
That helps.
Well, we're so depleted in minerals. I was just, I've always pushed people to like take a lot of magnesium, and it's like one of the most essential like minerals that you need in your body. And we're also depleted in it just because the soil's depleted. And if you keep growing vegetables in soil that's depleted, or even, local farming is great, right? We do a local farm, we raise our own cow. We have that, for us, and we do all local farm to table vegetables, and it's great.
Amazing. I'll end with one more question here before I ask for some parting words of advice. But do you have any products that you would recommend? And that could be anything, like something that comes up very often in your conversations that you think people should know about, that there are easy changes that they can implement right away.
Yeah. I mean, first and foremost, the first thing everybody should be doing is monitoring temperature and relative humidity in their home. That's like simple, right? You just go and, I like to give things that people can do on their own, that they don't need to buy anything, because it's just go down to your local hardware store and pick up what's called a hygrometer that has your temperature and relative humidity, and really try to stay in that relative humidity in your space between 30 and 50%. That's like the optimal level. And the reason that is because these things, like we're talking about dust mites and mold and bugs and these things that you have to eradicate or use a pesticide on, they respond to moisture, just like people do, right? They need it. So if you cut back that moisture and giving them that moisture that they need, you're going to have less of these contaminants in your home just by staying in that relative humidity range that we like, that 30 to 50%. So if, people can do that and monitor their temperature, monitor their humidity to start off, it's great. And then, don't store anything. Don't be storing paint cans in your home. Don't be storing stains, all these building products, gasoline, pesticides, herbicides. They don't belong in your home. They belong in an outside shed somewhere that you are not going to be breathing them in, because those cans are never sealed. They're constantly leaking. And so when I come in and test indoor air quality, I'll see all of that in your air. So, and paint cans are a huge offender. So just, when people, it's an easy tip, like start going through your house and kind of taking the stuff out, because you don't need it. It's just going to be creating a havoc for you. And then outside of that, I mean, testing products, obviously we love our Examine. We like to encourage people to test and to get an idea of what's going on in their home, because you can't see it. So we have a lot of testing kits. We also have our Predict, which is our VOC line, our Examine. We get into all kinds of things now. We're doing a lot with UV technology, which I like. And actually the UV that we use is out of Canada. So your homeland, but we like a company called Air Sniper now. They're making a great UV system that goes into your ductwork and can basically, the bulbs can last, 5 to 6 years, where instead of changing a bulb all the time with UV, because you get a lot of mold and things that grow in your ductwork, we can do a more sustainable program, which I like, and not have to change the bulbs every year. So things like that are really cool that we're, doing a lot with technologies.
Yeah, that's super interesting, because that's something that's come up before too, is ductwork, and we have to run ductwork in most of our houses.
Yes.
And yeah, if you don't clean them
You have
regularly,
to.
then there could be issues, and
Lots of
I'm a
issues.
culprit for that. So
Yeah, no, ductwork needs to be cleaned definitively. And people say, oh, it doesn't matter. It definitely does. Like if you have animals and all of that dust dander gets caught up in there. So, every 2 years, if you have pets, if you don't, you can get away with it like every 4. If you have it depends on how many occupants you have in the house. The more occupants you have, the more you have to clean. And especially if you do, any kind of remodeling project in the house with silica, you should definitely be cleaning your ducts after you do the project.
I'm assuming vacuuming is much better than sweeping, even if it's like a tile or hardwood.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Now, one more question, because it came up as you were talking. When you say keeping the relative humidity between 30 and 50, what if you don't have a good ventilation system in your home? So for example, like in Mexico, none of the houses have ERVs, HRV, like they're all mini splits. If you have air conditioning, it's mini split, you close the windows and doors. It's like, you don't have any ventilation, right? So sure, you could keep the humidity at a good point, but you're not going to get any good fresh air into that house anymore.
Right.
What do you do in that case?
Well, I mean, I think the biggest thing, I don't know how the temperature runs there. Is it drier outside? Like when you, like what I try to recommend.
It depends on where you are in Mexico, but where we are right now, it's super humid, right?
Yeah.
So we like the wind, we like the fresh air during the day. We just run the AC when we sleep. But the humidity goes up. We do have we are able to track the humidity, and we're going up to like 80%.
Right. And that's that's the problem. If you get that moisture saturation into your contents, and then that's how you get the mold growth. So yeah, it becomes challenging. We were doing in Costa Rica, we had to put in dehumidifiers in a lot of these places because they were just getting so moldy from all the humidity. The humidity comes in and then it just starts saturating stuff. And then everything will eventually grow mold if it's just left to, high humidity. So the air conditioning helps reduce your humidity. A byproduct of air conditioning is that it takes humidity out of the air. But, the minute you go and you put it on and you're getting that fresh air, and if it's outside, it's coming back in again. So that's where you have to start to look at dehumidifiers and dehumidifying the space and making sure you're trying to keep it down. And, a little bit's not going to harm you, but if it's consistent over time, you will start to grow mold, and then you get into problems too. But it also helps depending on what your building structures. Like down there, I'm assuming they're building in like adobe. Like, are they doing like adobes?
Mostly concrete. Everything's garbage. When they say it's green, there's all sorts of stuff in Tulum. It's like, oh, come check out our green new resort that we're building, and it's like they have bamboo, right? That's their sign of
laden with like formaldehyde and sprayed down with like.
I want to build stuff here so badly, just not right timing yet. But I feel like we could do really well because we could educate people and show people how to build properly and actually give them properly built homes that will keep them healthy, as opposed to make them sick.
Well, and a good
So-
question to you is that, I find too, there's this balance, right? Like, I don't know from my perspective that we've really mastered a healthy build. Like, I think that there's some things we've done really well with, and then other things get compromised, right? So it's finding that balance. And, with energy efficiency, we always talk about energy efficiency, and I've spoken to some of the best builders, right, who build these structures, and we still have so many issues with, getting rid of the moisture. And even if we put ERVs in, we've got different things that happen because of pressurization. Like, I had a house where they had a bunch of ERVs, and what happened with, when we're talking about radon again, and they were dealing with a chloridane issue. I don't know if you know what chloridane is, but chloridane is like one of the old time pesticides that they used to use, or it was an herbicide actually. And they used it on farms and things like that. And so this house had built on like an old farm. It was built on like an old farm. I think they did apples or something at the time. And they had all this chloridane that was coming up from the ground up. And so this is so interesting. So they were trying to put ERVs in, and they thought, well, if we bring pressure in from the outside, right, well, we're going to prevent it from pulling pressure up from the ground. But what happened was ERV went in the space where the ERV was actually, allowing airflow to come into that space. That kept the chloridane down in the ground. But in the interstitial wall cavities and anywhere the chloridane found its space up, it created this almost like volcanic activity. So the level went from, let's just say you were at a 2, went to a 35 in those spaces.
So they were pressurizing the house.
Right.
And then it was kind of pushing things up, and then it was, yeah, okay.
Well, anywhere it could find its way up. But when it came up, it didn't come up in just like the normal amount that it was coming up originally. It quadrupled. I mean, it went through the roof. And so I started to learn that, like, sometimes when you're trying to fight these things and make these houses so barrier proof, if you will, there's really no way to do that, because of this pressure that comes up from the earth, right? It's going to try to find its way up there no matter what. And it sort of
what
becomes
if you had a balanced system though? Like, if your system was balanced, you were bringing in fresh air and getting rid of stale air at the same rate. You weren't pressurizing or depressurizing the house.
Then you're going to be, but then you're still going to have like the chloridane issue, right? They still had it, but it wasn't, so they were trying to get rid of it because they were trying to prevent these things from coming up out of the ground. Like, and radon's one of those things, and, chloridane, there's other things that petroleum products.
That would be a separate system from the ERV though, right?
Yeah.
That would be, yeah.
But it's interesting, right? So it's like there's all these things that can come up through a foundation, that it's not just, moisture control or.
Were these houses, did they have basements?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm not a fan of basements. They
No.
are we build a lot of houses without basements now. And do you find those issues in houses that don't have basements?
Yeah, I mean, you would in that case, just because it would come up, right? Like, if it was under the ground, it's going to come up in whatever space you have. Like, so are you building a slab, or what are you building on? Like, if you're,
It'd be a slab, right? So we still have to dig down to get below frost, but then we seal under the slab, right? So we'll have insulation, we seal it, tape it, depending on what our insulation is underneath the slab. And then that gets tied to our air barrier in the walls and goes up to the roof and so forth. So everything gets sealed up.
If you had chloridane like exposure, I think it would probably help minimize that a little bit. You know what I mean? But if there was any gapping at all, it would just come up through, whatever space it could, unless it's like hermetically sealed. But it's interesting, and then what you have to realize is if you press it down there, it's going to come up somewhere, and then it's going to come up in abundance, because it's nature's way of getting the gas up, or whatever's in the ground, right? It could be petroleum product, it could be diesel, it could be whatever we're building on top of. So it's just kind of interesting to think about. That's what I want. I mean, you joke, but like, I don't believe in any of this ground. I don't believe in anything built on the ground. I believe we should be building on some kind of stilt formation, because I think we could use the airflow underneath to create all kinds of interesting, we could create so much kind of interesting draw with pressure and stuff. I've always said that, like, I think stilts or building high is key. I don't know why we build on the ground. I don't get it. Okay.
It's a good point. Less stairs. People are lazy. They don't want to walk up the stairs.
Well, you're the builder. I leave it up to you. I only like throw the idea
we
out
could
there.
do that. It would be easy. Where it makes it, for at least where we build, it makes it difficult to seal the floor and to insulate the floor properly to keep it comfortable, right? To keep the home comfortable if you have all these stilts, but it's possible. And the other issue would be plumbing. So where when you build anywhere that you have a septic or you need to get water or something, and it
Right. And then
freezes,
you
need
got
to be able
pipes
to
under
get
the
it
ground.
down,
Exactly.
right? So
Yeah.
you would need to have like an insulated chase that goes below the ground. It goes into your septic, or that goes into the sewers of the city, wherever you're building, right? So there'd be other things to work through. But in
It's a
warmer
tough-
climates, it's super easy.
Yeah.
to do
So it's in
anything
the
like that.
cold. Cause it's interesting. I think we need to put all of us in a room and then like all the different things we deal with, right? It's just like a giant think tank. And then we can
Yeah.
figure out like what's going on, because it's
Yeah.
interesting, and I get called in on so many crazy things. And when you have somebody who's got like chloridane exposure, people don't think about that when they're building a house. I mean, they don't think that we're putting houses on lots that, I had a client once that had, they were built in a rake guard factory, and so all of a sudden they would be it'd rain outside and they would smell like armpit, deodorant come up through the ground because it was just built on all this chemical. Then I had another client that
Crazy.
was built on an old factory for diesel fuel. It was a petroleum. I think it was like an old Exxon company that was out in California. So they would smell like
Wow.
diesel fuel all the time.
That's no fun.
No.
That hurts the value of your house too.
Oh God.
All right. So Carolyn, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much. This has been a long
welcome.
conversation, and I could keep going with more questions, but we
No,
will
it's
have to
great.
save it for round two.
Thank you for
Any
having me.
parting, you've already shared so much advice and wisdom, but any parting words of advice or wisdom or asks of our listeners and viewers?
Yeah, I really think people should be testing their home once a year for something, whether you're testing your water, you're testing, your air quality, checking your formaldehyde. You don't have to go crazy. It's like going to the doctor. Just think of your home. I consider myself like a home doctor. So check one thing a year, and then you can some things don't have to be tested once you know where you're at. So just cross these things off and make sure your environment's healthy, because it definitely impacts your life. And, you can add 10 years to your life by changing a lot of these things and making sure you're ventilating and reducing contaminants. So to me, it's like a no-brainer. Just, do one thing a year and you'll be good.
Well, thanks again, Carolyn.
Thank you.
Really appreciate all the wisdom and everything
Thanks
you
for
brought.
having me.
If you live in the US and you're looking to save money on your monthly electricity bills, head to theconsciousbuilder.com/solar. There's never been a better time to go solar because of the fact that there are fantastic incentives in the US, and because of the fact that solar has come down in price by over 50% in the last 10 years. Just go to theconsciousbuilder.com/solar to see if your home qualifies. And don't worry if you're concerned about the upfront cost, because there are fantastic financing opportunities that will still allow you to save money and not pay any money up front. Once again, that's theconsciousbuilder.com/solar. Until next time, I'm Casey Gray, and remember to live consciously.